Clean water is really just a symptom of a broader set of underlying problems. If we want to see meaningful change and improvement in water quality, then what we really have to focus on is improving our land use practices and the regulatory processes that are tied to our land use practices. So I'm a planner by training. I talk about land use a lot, so we'll talk about it a little bit today too. And land use is not only important in terms of protecting our environmental quality, our ground and surface water resources, but it's also critically important for things like quality of life. The decisions that we make in land use determine the diversity of our housing stock, the types of jobs that we have, the amount of open space and parkland, the amount of traffic, our tax burdens. Those are all decisions that are impacted and really driven by the decisions in our land use practices. In addition to being important in terms of quality of life as well as environmental quality, land use is critically important for two other reasons. Number one, the changes that come about in our land use practice typically occur very quickly over very brief periods of time, years or even just a couple decades. In addition, those decisions that are made in the land use process last a long time for generations. So it's critically important for our environmental quality, for our quality of life that we make good decisions, and also because we live with those decisions for a long time. So the image that you see up on the screen now is an aerial photograph from 1947 in western Suffolk County. And everything you see on that image is either farmland or woodland. Again, 1947, and then if we just speed up the time frame a little bit and look a couple decades later, that farmland and woodland is completely gone. And that's pretty much the way it looks today. So those decisions that were made over just a couple decades continue to impact communities today and occurred, again, in a very brief period of time. Everything you see on this image is woodland. And again, if we just look a couple decades later, all that woodland is completely gone, and we're still living with the impacts of those decisions that were made today. In addition to just changing the amount of open space that we have, we also see impacts in terms of our environmental resources. This is an area along the south shore of Long Island in western Suffolk County. And that area that you see in the center of the screenshot is actually all marshland. And unfortunately, we haven't over time made good decisions in all of these locations. So if you look at what that looks like today, what we see is an 18-hole golf course, very high density residential development, and at the bottom of the screen what you're actually looking at is the region's largest sewage treatment plant, the Bergen Point Sewage Treatment Plant. That processes about 30 million gallons a day of waste that then gets pumped out into the ocean. So we're taking groundwater, precious groundwater, a finite supply for us, something we need to protect for generations. We're contaminating it with our waste, and then we're pumping it under the Great South Bay, under Fire Island, out into the ocean, in largely an untreated format. That's all still nitrogen rich. So we're not fixing the problem, we're actually just displacing it when we do these practices. And again, investing in this type of infrastructure in the area that's at the highest risk of storm events doesn't make a lot of sense either from a public policy standpoint. So these land use decisions, again, are critically important. This is an area in the town of Brookhaven. What you're looking at is the changes that take place over time, taking a woodland, and now what you see is what appears to be a lake. What that lake is actually is exposed groundwater. This is a sand mine in Manorville in the town of Brookhaven, and they've mined so much material from the property that they're actually into our drinking water supply. And it's hard to see, but in the middle of that image there's actually a barge that's floating on top of our water table on our drinking water, continuing to mine sand from underneath the aquifer. So one of the things we talk about when we talk about land use is it's important to put our development patterns into context. So let's talk about Suffolk County, because we hear a lot from the development community, and we hear a lot, quite honestly, from some elected officials about how we have to grow the economy in order to stabilize our taxes. So let's look at where we're at in terms of growth. In terms of population, Suffolk County has about 1.5 million people. There are 3,143 counties in the country. 3,143. Suffolk County is the 23rd most populated out of those 3,000 odd counties. So then the next question you ask as a planner is, okay, we have a lot of people. Is that just because we have a lot of land area, or are we actually very dense, meaning do we have a lot of people living per square mile or a lot of homes per acre? And unfortunately, when we look at population density, we're actually the 81st most dense county in the country. So putting that in perspective, we're in the top 1% in total population. We're in the top 3% in population density. It's also important, and when we analyze these things, to know what what is the density of our development patterns that's caused these problems that we have today. So we also talk about not only people per square mile, but houses per acre or housing density. And in Suffolk County, it's really a tale of two counties. 90% of the county population is in western Suffolk, the 5 western towns. So there's about 1.3 million people in western Suffolk and about 150,000 people in eastern Suffolk. And the housing density reflects that. So in eastern Suffolk, density averages about 1 unit per acre, or 1 house for every acre. Some towns are a little bit under that, some towns are a little bit over that, but about 1 unit per acre in eastern Suffolk, and any place from 3 to 6 units per acre in western Suffolk, meaning 3 housing units per acre. Those are the development densities that have caused the problems that we have today. What's made the problem worse is out of those 3,143 counties, we also have the least restrictive health department standards in the country out of those 3,000 odd counties. So the fact that we have water quality impairments or water quality problems is really not a surprise, or shouldn't be a surprise. It's a predictable outcome when you have high population density, and lax standards in terms of your sanitary code. If you put Nassau and Suffolk together, it's the 7th densest country on earth. If you put all of Long Island together with Brooklyn and Queens, it's the 3rd densest place on earth. That should give us pause when we talk about more development will somehow fix our problems. Again, it hasn't worked in 60 years or 70 years since World War II. It doesn't stand to reason that a little more density on top of what we already have is somehow going to reverse the tide. So if we want to see improvements both in terms of our environmental resources, our quality of life, as well as our economic model, then we have to change our thinking. So what is government's responsibility? Some people feel like we should be spending more money on open space and social programs. Some people think we should be spending less money in general and more on, say, defense or economic development. But I think in general, we can all agree on certain basics, that government has a fundamental responsibility to protect our health, our safety, and our welfare. And in fact, if you open up any zoning code, the set of rules that guide our land development in all of our 33 villages and 10 towns, they all say the same thing. Zoning is intended to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And if we drill that down, or better define that into clean air and clean water, then we, I think, can all agree that, despite all of our differences, I think everybody feels they have a basic right to clean air and clean water as a part of government's responsibilities to us. So let's look at some of the data on that based upon the population, the density that we have now. And I'll spend most of my time on water quality since this is Water Matters. So nitrogen is one of the leading contaminants of both groundwater, our drinking water supply, as well as surface water. And nitrogen comes from a number of basic sources. It comes from our waste. It comes from fertilizer, both tied to agriculture as well as home lawn application, and it comes atmospherically through deposition. Despite all of our best efforts to protect against nitrogen increases, because of the health impacts and the environmental impacts tied to elevated nitrogen levels, nitrogen has nonetheless increased by more than 200% since 1987. A 200% increase despite all of our best efforts and all of the complaints to the development community that we're overly restrictive and we don't allow enough development. We can already see that the rules that we have in place haven't been effective at all in keeping down something as simple as nitrogen. In addition, pesticides are an increasing problem in our drinking water supply and our surface water supply. Health department officials have now detected 117 different pesticide-related compounds in our drinking water supplies. 117 different compounds. Now, they will tell you that the compounds have been detected or after treatment are at a safe level below what the US EPA says is safe for public consumption. And that should be a comfort. And I think groundwater and drinking water is largely safe. But what they can't tell you is what about that toxic cocktail of 117 different pesticide-related compounds with elevated levels of nitrogen and with what we call emerging contaminants, which are personal care products and pharmaceuticals, which are also increasingly being detected both in our drinking water supply and our surface water supplies. Volatile organic compounds are also something that are an increasing concern for our public health in both our drinking water supply and our surface water supply, and they come from things like industrial solvents as well as household goods like shampoos and conditioners. And VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, have doubled in concentration and quadrupled in frequency since 1987. We also have in Nassau and Suffolk counties more Superfund sites, federally designated contaminated sites, than any other region in New York State. We have 254 of them scattered throughout Nassau and Suffolk counties. And that's not including the 575 state-designated contaminated sites. Because our drinking water is hydrologically linked to our surface waters, what we do on our land not only impacts our drinking water supply, our groundwater, but it also impacts our surface waters. And we can see the impacts on our surface waters in a host of different indicators. Some of the previous speakers here in this series have talked about harmful algal blooms. Those are largely driven by nitrogen. So the more nitrogen we're putting into our groundwater, the more it's getting into our surface water, the more it's impacting nitrogen blooms, algal blooms, excuse me. That has decimated some of our shellfish populations. In the 1970s, one out of every two clams in the Great South Bay, one out of every two clams, excuse me, in the United States came from the Great South Bay. Over 700,000 bushels of clams were removed from the Great South Bay, 700,000 in 1976. In 2009, that number was 7,000 bushels, a 99% decline. Some of that is due to overharvesting and poor fisheries management, but a large part of that is also due to the fact that our water quality has impacted and prevented the ability of those populations to rebound. Same thing with the scallop population in the Peconic estuary. In 1986, 450,000 pounds of scallop meat was harvested from the Peconic estuary, 450,000 pounds. 10 years later, in 1996, it was 53 pounds. So again, we know, based on science, that those impacts, those declines are directly related to human activities on the land that are impacting our water quality. And we see the same thing with lobsters, with mussels, and with oysters, quite honestly. We now have, on average, 10,000 acres of closed shellfish beds every year due to toxins. 10,000 acres of shellfish beds that we can't use because we would get sick if we actually harvested the bounty from those waters. We also have a growing litany of impaired waters, waters that are designated by the state as no longer able to function for recreational and fishing purposes or swimming purposes as they're intended. And we also have a host of actually beach closures and beach advisories each year. So here's an image of one of the harmful algal blooms. This is blue-green algae in the town of Southampton and Lake Agawam. Blue-green algae, if it's in a dense enough concentration, if it's high enough in terms of a concentration, is actually fatal not only to shellfish and finfish, but to people, to pets. And in fact, there were years ago, there was actually a dog that died on Georgia Pond from just licking its paws with water that had been tainted with blue-green algae. We also see brown tides, rust tides, rud tides. This is a brown tide in Moneybog Bay in the town of Southampton. Again, this is not only from an aesthetic standpoint a concern, but from an environmental standpoint, this is fatal for shellfish populations. So in looking at these things, instead of looking from a governmental standpoint, instead of recognizing the problem and saying we need to take a time out, we need to reform our development policies so that they're more protective of the environment and more protective of public health, unfortunately, we've gone in the opposite direction. At the same time, in terms of trends, governmental trends, in addition to having these massively dense development projects, we also are in the process of funding a wealth of infrastructure improvements. The county is right now looking at 22 new locations for sewering. The governor just issued more than $400 million to the county for sewer upgrades and sewer expansions in communities like Babylon, Brookhaven, and Islip. And again, 22 other locations are also being started, including locations out east in Riverside and Flanders and the village of Southampton and the village of West Hampton Beach, even all the way out in East Hampton and places like Montauk and Springs, where they're looking at sewer technology as a potential to addressing water quality impairments. The problem with that theory is that if you're using sewers to treat existing development, that's great, because it will lower the loads of pollutants in contrast to a standard septic system. However, if sewers also allow for a dramatic increase in development density, you cancel out any of those benefits the additional filtering has. So if we really want to fix our problems, in terms of water quality, we have to stop thinking that we can grow our way out of this problem. We have to stop using our economic model being as build, baby, build. We have to figure out a way to not only protect public health and our environmental resources, but to also reform our land use practices so we can start developing things that actually maintain our quality of life and protect our resources at the same time. I think moving forward, what we need to do is to, again, focus more on land use and a little bit less on infrastructure and technological solutions, because what we really have is a regulatory failure. Throwing billions of infrastructure dollars at the problem without reforming our land use practices will accomplish little. So we need to take a step back and, again, address our regulatory environment first before we start investing billions.